Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into a pivotal moment in the American Revolution, but specifically looking at Virginia.
Right.
Now, you probably know the usual story, founding fathers, liberty, fighting tyranny, and yeah, that's definitely part of it.
Absolutely. It's the story we all learn.
But the sources we're digging into today, especially leaning on excerpts from Woody Holton's Forced Founders, well, they paint a different picture. A much more complex one, maybe even a bit surprising.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive, really, to use these sources to see what else was pushing Virginia towards independence. It wasn't just about high ideals. We're looking at pressures from groups you don't always hear about in this context. Native Americans, those powerful British merchants, certainly enslaved people, and, even regular white Virginians, small farmers.
And how their struggles, often financial, tangled up with the elite's problems.
Yeah, it's about understanding that break with Britain, not just as some philosophical decision, but as a reaction to all these different forces sort of converging and pushing the colony over the edge.
Okay, let's unpack this then. And maybe we should start with something that seems a bit strange when you think about figures like Jefferson or Washington. The sources say that Virginia gentry, these big names, were often swimming in debt, like serious debt.
That's such a critical piece of the puzzle. These guys weren't always the comfortable, secure elite we might imagine. The whole British economic setup, especially things like the Navigation Acts, these rules basically forced colonies like Virginia to trade mainly with Britain.
Right, especially for tobacco growers.
Exactly. They got locked into relying on British markets, British merchants, and British credit. And that credit just piled up. It often became crushing debt.
And it wasn't just numbers on a page, right? The sources give some pretty intense examples of how this debt fueled real conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Vivid stuff, like the incident with John Chiswell, a Virginia gentleman, killing Robert Routledge, who was a Scottish merchant. The sources really emphasized Chiswell's anger, apparently calling Routledge a villain who came to Virginia to cheat. You can feel the tension there, that debt, class, even that sort of resentment towards the Scottish merchants.
And it turned violent.
Mm-hmm.
Chiswell, apparently furious over money and maybe feeling insulted, actually killed him. That level of personal anger tied to finance,
Yeah.
it really shows you the raw feelings involved.
It does. And this debt issue reached right into the highest levels. Think about that New River Lead Mine project the sources mentioned. You had major players involved: John Robinson, the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, William Burt III, Chiswell again.
Mm-hmm.
That venture ran into trouble, partly because the land ended up west of the Proclamation Line. That boundary meant to limit expansion. And here's the really stark part. The sources suggest that 3 partners, Chiswell, Robinson, and Byrd, might have died by suicide, possibly linked to the debts from that failed venture, and others hampered by British rules.
Wow. That speaks volumes about the pressure, the sheer desperation some of these men must have felt.
It really does. And it wasn't just the absolute top tier either. You see figures like Jacob Height, wealthy, yes, but also drowning in debt. He apparently resorted to attacking a jail to stop his property being seized, even tried arming his slaves against the sheriff, all before he was killed by Cherokees. Just desperate actions driven by debt.
So the takeaway here, reading these sources, seems to be that for Virginia's elite, this debt wasn't just a personal money problem. It became this intense political pressure point. It made them resent the whole British system that seemed set up to keep them financially dependent.
Exactly. Their bank accounts, or lack thereof, got tangled up with their politics. It created this really potent grievance against British control, this feeling of being exploited by creditors overseas.
Okay, so that's the debt tied to trade. But there was another huge economic driver pushing the gentry, wasn't there? This obsession with land out west.
Absolutely. Land speculation was huge for them. And this is where Native American nations become really central to the story, not just as, obstacles on a map, but as active forces defending their homelands.
Right. British policy, like that proclamation of 1763, you mentioned that line down the Appalachians, it directly blocked a lot of the gentry's big land schemes.
Yeah.
They saw fortunes to be made out west, and London seemed more interested in avoiding costly wars with Indians than helping Virginia speculators get rich.
And the sources are clear. The native nations weren't just passively waiting, they were actively resisting. Groups like the Shawnees, Delawares, Cherokees, the powerful Iroquois, they were forming alliances, confederacies, and crucially, they were stockpiling weapons. They were preparing to fight for their land.
Yeah, the sources mentioned British agents like George Croghan being genuinely worried about a coordinated attack from a native confederacy. There was this real fear that the Indians believed the British ultimately wanted all their land, pushing them towards armed resistance. It made westward expansion risky, unpredictable.
which in turn seems to have fueled the gentry's desire for independent control over that territory. If Virginia could call the shots, free from British oversight that sometimes prioritized peace or native rights, they could pursue their land grabs more aggressively. The sources even note Patrick Henry buying into disputed land, basically gambling that the proclamation line would eventually be shifted in Virginia's favor.
And the treaty situation really shows that friction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The British make one deal with the Cherokees setting a boundary.
Right.
Then almost immediately, British agents help the Iroquois sell the exact same land to Virginia speculators in another treaty. The speculators were banking on their claim, backed by the Iroquois and British connections, overriding the Cherokee one. It was messy.
It was incredibly messy, and what it reveals is this direct clash. The gentry's economic ambitions tied to land versus British imperial policy, and the undeniable power and resistance of native nations. It created this major grievance: we can't get the land we want under British rule, and that became another powerful push towards wanting to go it alone.
Okay, so we've got debt pushing them, blocked land ambitions pulling them. But the pressure cooker wasn't just about economics of the frontier. Virginia had this huge internal vulnerability, its massive enslaved population, something like 40% by 1775. And the sources stress the constant underlying white fear of revolt.
Absolutely, a pervasive fear.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the sources link this fear back to the British economic system again. They point out that powerful British merchant lobbies consistently fought to keep the Atlantic slave trade going.
Even when Virginia tried to limit it.
Yes. Virginia made attempts putting higher duties on imported slaves, sending petitions in the late 1760s, early 1770s. But London, influenced by those merchant interests, kept striking down Virginia's laws.
So the trade continued, forcing more enslaved people into the colony.
Which, from the gentry's viewpoint, ramped up the danger. It increased the enslaved population, increasing the perceived security risk. It's fascinating that Thomas Jefferson, whose own inherited debt, by the way, was partly tied to a slave trading venture that went bad, listed the king's forcing of the slave trade on the colonies as a major grievance in his first draft of the Declaration of Independence. For him, it was personal and political.
And then things really escalated with the royal governor, Lord Dunmore.
Oh, dramatically. As tensions were boiling over, Dunmore issued his famous proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person who would abandon their rebel masters and fight for the British. Suddenly, the abstract fear became a terrifying reality. Enslaved people were seeking freedom by joining the British. The sources mentioned Joseph Harris, an enslaved pilot, joining a British ship, which led directly to the Battle of Hampton. It made the threat immediate.
And it wasn't just isolated incidents, right? The sources talk about widespread panic in the spring of 1775, rumors of slave conspiracies flying around in Williamsburg, Chesterfield, Pitt County, lots of places. And white Virginians often connected these rumors directly to the British. The idea that the British were deliberately trying to stir up a slave rebellion was horrifying to them.
Utterly terrifying. So if you connect that deep-seated fear to the push for independence, you see a really powerful motivator emerge from the sources. The gentry felt that white unity was absolutely critical to maintain control over the enslaved population. British actions, especially Dunmore's proclamation, seemed calculated to destroy that unity, to unleash chaos from within.
So independence wasn't just about throwing off British rule, it was also about regaining control internally.
Exactly. It started to look like the only way to guarantee their ability to control the enslaved population, to restore order, and basically ensure their own safety from what they saw as this existential internal threat. The internal dynamics of Virginia slave society were absolutely shaping their political decisions.
But it wasn't just the elite feeling the pressure, was it? What about the majority of white Virginians, the small farmers, the tenants? The sources bring them into the picture too, right? They were also struggling with debt and hard times in the 1770s.
Yes, absolutely crucial. And those protests against Britain, like the non-importation and non-exportation agreements, boycotting British goods and refusing to ship tobacco.
Yeah.
Well, the sources suggest that for many ordinary indebted farmers, these weren't just political statements. They were also, let's say, conveniently timed economic relief measures. It gave them a socially acceptable reason to stop paying their British creditors and hold on to their crops, hoping prices might improve.
Ah, okay, so a mix of politics and pocketbook issues.
Very much so. And you see direct resistance ramping up, too. The sources mention people breaking debtors out of jail, physically attacking sheriffs who were trying to seize property for debt. There was even the burning of the Dinwiddie County Courthouse in 1773, likely an attempt to destroy debt records.
And this connects to the courts shutting down in 1774.
It seems so. Officially, the story was about a dispute over how court officials got paid the Fee Act expiring. But accounts cited in the sources, like one by John Burke, argue the real motive, or at least a major underlying one, was simply to stop debt collection lawsuits altogether.
Wow. So the courts closed, and creditors couldn't pursue farmers for debt.
Right. It effectively gave a huge chunk of the population indebted small farmers breathing room. It let them weather the economic storm and participate in the boycotts without fear of losing their farms.
But this period wasn't all unified resistance. The sources also mention tensions within white society.
Oh, definitely. There was pushback from smallholders against joining the new militia units led by the gentry. There were real fears of social unrest over shortages. Salt was a big one. People worried about riots if they couldn't preserve food. And you saw open class conflict emerging.
Like the tenant revolt.
Exactly. The Loudoun County Tenant Revolt in 1775-76 is a striking example. Tenants just started refusing to pay rent to their wealthy landlords. They organized themselves, declared rent collection unjust. There were figures like James Cleveland openly telling tenants, pay no rents.
How did the gentry react to that?
With alarm, the sources quote one gentleman worrying about plebeian infamy. They saw the social hierarchy, the economic order among whites starting to fray. It was another layer of instability they had to deal with.
Okay, so let's try and pull all these threads together. We've got the gentry squeezed by debt and frustrated land ambitions. We have the deep, pervasive fear of slave rebellion made worse by British actions. And now we see rising discontent and disorder among the white smallholders and tenants, also driven by economic hardship. How did all this shift the needle toward independence?
Well, the sources argue pretty convincingly that independence, which had seemed like a really radical step, something many gentry were hesitant about initially, started to look increasingly like a practical necessity by late 1775, early 1776.
Less about abstract ideals, more about solving immediate pressing problems.
Precisely. Independence seemed to offer solutions. It meant Virginia could set its own land policy, ignore the proclamation line. It meant they could finally stop the slave trade, which they increasingly saw as dangerous. It opened the door to trading directly with other countries, like France, which could ease the economic pain and, crucially, bring in needed supplies, salt, weapons.
And importantly for the gentry, it meant they could establish their own strong government.
Yes. A government with the authority to restore order, to put down dissent, whether from enslaved people or from those rebellious tenants and debtors. Control was a huge factor.
But it wasn't just the gentry pushing for this, right? What about the smallholders?
They had their own reasons, according to the sources. For many smallholders, independence and the shift toward republicanism looked like an opportunity for more religious freedom, which was a big issue for dissenting groups like Baptists. And, maybe most importantly, a chance for a bigger say in government, a move towards more democracy.
And we see evidence of that.
Yeah, the county instructions to delegates in 1776 are pretty explicit. Many counties told their representatives to vote for independence. And the elections in April 76 are telling. Delegates were specifically chosen based on their stance on independence. Incumbents who were against it got voted out even in places like Richmond County, where tenants reportedly voted against the old gentry candidates. There was a real push from below, converging with the gentry's changing perspective.
So that brings us back to this core idea from the sources, the forced founders concept. The argument is that the revolution in Virginia wasn't just driven by lofty ideals or taxes alone.
Right. It was shaped, maybe even necessitated, by this complex web of pressures coming from all directions. You had Native Americans fighting for their land, influencing British policy and frontier security. You had British merchants whose economic power, especially regarding the slave trade, created deep resentment and risk in Virginia.
You had enslaved people whose very presence and desire for freedom created constant fear, and whose actions during the conflict intensified that fear immensely.
Exactly. And then you had all those indebted white Virginians, gentry and small farmers alike, desperate for financial relief. Plus, the growing demands from smallholders and tenants for more rights and their willingness to challenge the existing order.
So it's like all these different groups acting in their own interests.
Created a situation that the Virginia gentry found they just couldn't manage anymore within the British system. The sources suggest that independence, that radical break, started to look like the best, maybe the only way to protect their economic futures, grab that Western land, restore social control, and basically secure their own position at the top.
It wasn't just a clean philosophical break based on rights talk. It was a reaction, maybe even a desperate one, to all these forces bubbling up from below and pressing in from outside.
That's the picture the sources paint. A much messier, more complicated, and frankly more interesting picture of how Virginia ended up embracing revolution.
Well, there you have it. Our deep dive into a different take on the American Revolution in Virginia. It really underscores how events were shaped by people and forces often left in the footnotes of the standard story, and how economics and social tensions were right there at the heart of it.
It definitely challenges that simpler narrative. The sources push us to see independence not just as an ideological choice, but as a pragmatic, maybe even pressured response to a whole host of grievances and threats impacting everyone from the plantation owner down to the tenant farmer and the enslaved person.
So maybe a final thought for you listening at home to chew on based on all this. What does it really tell us about how big historical changes happen?
Yeah.
When you see all these different groups, Indians defending sovereignty, merchants chasing profit, enslaved people seeking freedom, debtors trying to survive, all pursuing their own goals, and somehow, maybe without intending it, they all contribute to pushing society towards a massive upheaval, like a revolution.
It certainly makes you look beyond the famous leaders and the grand declarations, doesn't it? It forces you to consider the complex, often conflicting motivations and pressures acting on everyone involved.
Absolutely. Well, keep digging, keep questioning those narratives. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.